Tensions seem to be at a new high in the Russia-Ukraine war. In the United States, well, we're caught right in the middle of it.
Russia launched a nuclear-capable missile last week in response to President Biden's decision to allow Ukraine to use long-range U.S.-made missiles. Joining us now for the latest assessment on some of the international escalation, retired U.S. diplomat Jack Segal is joining us. Jack, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Eric and Bill. It's nice to be back with you. Sorry I'm not down there.
Hey, that's all right.
But,
that's all right. We never have enough time with you, Jack, so we'll jump right into this. Talk to us about this latest missile strike from Russia into Ukraine. It was not a nuclear warhead, but it certainly could have been. Talk about the significance of that.
Yes, it's a very serious development, and I apologize for bringing it to everyone's living room right before Thanksgiving. But the situation in Ukraine is deteriorating and getting more dangerous. The Russians fired a missile, which was a very powerful missile. It was designed as an intermediate range missile, which means it would threaten European countries, not the United States. But it was a clear message from Putin that a response really to the decision by President Biden and the British to allow the use of their long-range missiles, which had been restricted in their range, to start using them against the Russians inside Russia, in the part of Russia that Ukraine occupied a few months ago, which amounts to about 200 square miles of the Kursk region of Western Russia.
Now, Jack, very recently, Putin lowered the threshold for what would allow, I guess, in their mind, for Russia to instigate a nuclear attack. Now, this all seems kind of an arbitrary threat because, frankly, in the position that Putin's in, it could just be he woke up on the wrong side of the bed on a Tuesday. So is this a scare tactic, or is there a real threat of nuclear war from Russia?
I would say no, there is not a threat of nuclear war, except a quote from Putin directly, which says that Russia has the right to strike nations that allow their weapons to be used against Russian facilities. So this is directly from Putin. It doesn't use the word nuclear. That missile that they fired at the city of Dnipro, a city of 1 million people, is nuclear capable and was designed to launch multiple nuclear warheads. But Russia's kind of walking a tightrope here. Putin made his statement, which sounds quite threatening, against the U.S. and the UK. But he didn't name either of those countries, our country or UK, directly. And then, somewhat surprisingly to me, he announced the launch to something called the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center in Washington before the launch took place, so that we would not misinterpret that particular launch as being against the United States or one of our allies, but rather against Ukraine. So he's trying to keep the temperature down a bit.
Hey, Jack, what I really appreciate about your expertise is your personal background with evaluating nuclear risk reduction. We've done a story with you before about how you were there in person to draft the agreement between the U.S. and Russia back in the 1980s. So in the almost 40 years since that had happened, how is our relationship with Russia today?
Our relationship with Russia is almost non-existent or negative, I would say. Even in the worst of times when we were back in the 80s, when we were serving in the Soviet Union, we stayed in contact and we continued to meet. We continued to have discussions, even when they weren't very successful or weren't very productive. The idea was to keep the door open to talking. We are not really talking to Russia at the moment, and so we're just sending these messages, as I mentioned, that one nuclear notification, which was a positive thing. But on the normal day-to-day issues that we would normally be discussing with Russia, they have cut back our representation in Moscow and closed our consulates elsewhere in Russia, and we have reciprocated. So that where we used to have a couple hundred people in Moscow, now we're down to bare bones, barely keeping the lights on. And the
Oh,
same
wow.
is true for the Russians in Washington, and we have closed their consulates around the United States.
Now,
So we're not in a communicative mode, and that is always a bad idea
Sure.
because you can have misunderstandings.
now, how, with all of our consulates closing, not having that communication that allows us to rebuild that bridge with Russia, and the U.S. taking a pro-Ukraine stance, now Donald Trump coming back to the White House, where do you see the U.S.-Russia relationship being in, let's say, just a few years or even in a year's time?
Well, President-elect Trump has said, first of all, he will solve on day one. He's going to have a busy day one, but on day one, he's going to solve the Ukraine problem. He's going to negotiate directly with President Zelensky and President Putin. We'll see. We'll see if both of them agree to that, for one thing. But secondly, what is going to be on the table? What is the solution? I don't think a peace agreement is in the cards, but I do think that these three presidents can get their heads together and decide on a ceasefire. That would be a ceasefire in place, so the Russian troops that are in Ukraine would stay there, and the Ukrainian troops that are in Russia would stay there. The wild card in all this is the North Koreans. Surprisingly, uh, Russia has increased its relationship with North Korea, and 10,000 North Korean troops have arrived in that area where the Ukrainians control that piece of Russia, that 200 square miles. So, since North Korea, I would assume, could provide an unlimited number of additional troops, Putin is effectively signaling, I can outlast you. I can outlast Ukraine, and I can outlast the United States and our allies.
Jack, in our final minute or so here, you've touched on it briefly, but is there a list of things that Russia wants in order to get to that ceasefire, and really how much leverage does Russia have compared to the U.S. influence?
Yes, Russia wants a promise that Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO. That Ukraine will be a neutral country with a limited military capability, and basically it will be part of Russia's area of control. That is obviously not going to be acceptable to the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians are running out of troops. They are taking losses, and they are hesitating to conduct a broad draft that would bring in all the young people into their army. So Ukraine is on their back foot now. Russia feels very confident that they can continue this war for as long as it takes. And when President Trump takes over, we'll have to see if the United States is going to take a hard line against Russia, or is President Trump going to basically accept the status quo and let the United States withdraw from that conflict?
Got it. Well, Jack, always great to have you with us and share your insight with our audience. Really appreciate you taking up some time on the holiday week to talk with us.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, and happy holidays to everyone.
Yeah,
Happy holidays to you, Jack.